Okay, so we last left off, we're talking about serous membranes in particular. So we talked a little bit about the fist and the balloon situation, right? So what that broke us down into was whenever you have any organs, you basically have this kind of sac-like structure where the visceral layer is laying right on top of the organ itself. Then you have a little bit of a cavity in between the visceral layer, and then you have the parietal layer, right, which is the outer layer, which kind of lines the wall of the cavity itself. Okay, and that's pretty typical. So in the pericardial chamber, that is that lower mediastinum area that we kind of pointed out before. That's going to be your pericardium. So that's kind of like the name of the liners, the pericardial membranes that line the interior of the pericardial cavity. In the lungs, it's the pleural cavity. So the pleural membranes, the visceral pleura, that's the pleural. That's a term related to lungs. Like, so for instance, pleuritis, for instance, is an inflammation of the membrane, the serous membranes of the lungs. So these have their individual names. We talked a little bit about the digestive system last time, right? So that the membranes there are a little bit different. You certainly do have the visceral layer covering the organs, but you got a lot of space in there. There's a lot of stuff going on in there. So you got the space part is bigger than normal. And so, but you still have the liners in there. And when you're talking about the digestive system and the abdominal system, it's the peritoneum. So the peritoneal liners, those are all serous membranes. So they're covering either the organ or the cavity or both, in which, depending on which one you're talking about. And so you'll kind of run into that. And in 2102, you kind of cover that again as you get into those specific systems, because those are important structures associated with those organ systems that you have to sort of pin down and understand before you can kind of get too deep, right? So like, for instance, when you take a look at the peritoneum, because it's a little trickier, right? You kind of don't have this nice clean, like the fist and the balloon thing where you have like, okay, so this is the viscera, this is the cavity, this is the parietal. That's very easy and clean. When your cavity is really big and there's like a lot of open space in there, then it kind of gets a little confusing. And so a lot of times what happens is the visceral membranes kind of organize themselves into like a lot of different structures and sheets of membrane. And so especially in the abdominal system, some of that folded membrane, the visceral peritoneum, is what we refer to specifically anatomically as the mesenteries. So the mesenteries are these little folds of visceral membrane. That's what they are. They're actually part of that visceral serous membrane system that basically will kind of hold all your organs together. So it's like your intestines aren't just a freewheeling tube that's just sort of squirming around in there and just sort of falling all over the place. Your organs are all actually linked together. They're all sort of tied together with these visceral membranes. And these visceral membranes will have their own little specific names to them. But they're globally under the general family, what's referred to as a mesentery. So I don't know if you've ever seen small intestines and you kind of pull them apart. It's like there's this sort of like membranous webbing in between them. Those are the mesenteries. That's part of that visceral layer of the serous membranes. It's kind of holding all those intestines together so that it's not like oozing all over the place and squirming. So like every time you move, they're not like popping out, you know, and sort of squirming all around, because that'd be very uncomfortable, right? So they're kind of all held in place that way. And so you kind of have it all packaged and nicely put down. This also actually doesn't just hold everything together, but it also creates channels and pathways so that you can get all these organs connected to the things you need to be connected to, right? Because the problem with this is the more complexity you have in your organs, like the further and the crazier they are, the more like weirdly organized they are, like the intestines like flung all over the place, the harder it is to tie them all together with all the things they need, like nervous innervation or blood supply, things of that nature. And so if you're kind of in a big open cavity, you don't really have the main conduits that you usually have to be able to get to those sources and to feed them, basically. The mesenteries then provide a sheet that acts as sort of a thoroughfare that you can run your nerves and your arteries to these other organs, so they're not just out there in isolation. Okay, so it kind of pulls it all together a little bit, kind of creates a little bit of a pathway. for them. And you kind of see this, right? Because if you saw that same picture of intestines that are all kind of tied together with this webbing like mesenteries, you'll notice inside that webbing isn't just clear like cellophane like webbing. There's actually arteries and things of that nature that are running through that little webbing area on their way to the intestines to kind of pull everything together. You guys will see that actually quite well in AMP too. Now, there's another particular positional sort of thing that's actually pretty important, but it's actually not too common. And that's this concept of what's called retroperitoneal. This is a positional term. And basically what this means is behind the peritoneum. What peritoneum? Typically what we're referring to here is the parietal peritoneum, right? So this right here would be the visceral peritoneum, right? It's covering the organs, tying the organs together, and sort of connecting them to necessary vasculature. This one right here is associated with the parietal. Now, the peritoneal membrane, if you take a look at your abdominal cavity, you'll see that you have this sheet of membrane against the backside of your abdominal cavity. And it kind of looks like wallpaper, basically. And what you'll also notice is there are some things that have been papered over, right? It's kind of like the classic I Love Lucy episode when Ethel and Lucy were trying to wallpaper the house, and they wallpapered the window and the door, and Ethel, who was basically this big lump right in the middle of the wallpaper. That gag actually came from I Love Lucy. It's been used many times since. But that's retroperitoneal, right? So what happens is the abdominal liner, that parietal peritoneum, covers the backside of the abdominal cavity. But there are some organs that are behind that, and those are called retroperitoneal. A good example of that is your kidneys. Your kidneys are not actually technically part of this serous cavity system. They lie outside of this system. So they're actually smashed up against the abdominal cavity wall, and that cavity liner, the parietal liner, goes over them. So they look like they're sort of masked when you kind of cut open the cat. That's retroperitoneal. We already talked a little bit about some inflammation. So for instance, peritonitis, which is inflammation of the peritoneum. Pleurisy is inflammation of the pleura. Pericarditis is inflammation of the pericardium. Notice the term itis basically is referring to inflammation of something, right? So that's typical. Pleurisy is kind of a little bit of the outlier in that case. So it's kind of a slight offshoot, right? So you always have to have some wrench in the system. It can never make too much sense. You got to have something in there. Pleurisy is a hilarious term to me because it sounds like something that my great grandma used to actually think of that like shouldn't exist anymore. You know, kind of like calling everything dropsy instead of like a heart attack. It's like, you know, how come pleurisy survived and not dropsy? That would have been a fun one. What'd you die? Dropsy? Okay. What does that mean? Don't know. Welcome to medicine. Grab a knife. Anyway. Sorry, that's 19th century medicine. That's 19th century med school, right? So, can you cut? Go at it. Dig the bullet out. Ignore the screams. Anyway. Yeah, I mean, when your idea of medicine is to, cut a person's leg off and put it on the pile, yeah, that's Civil War territory right there. Okay, so that's the end of one. Any questions on one? Ready to take the exam on it? You guys like, no, wait. You guys like, you're like, wait, now you're kind of moving too fast here. Didn't say anything about exams. Don't get ugly about it here. Right. Okay, so then let's go into chapter 4. Now you'll notice that when I am pulling up our PowerPoints, I am pulling up the PowerPoints that are posted on D2L. So what I want to do first of all